All right, welcome to the Faithful Five podcast. My name is Tom Consumo, and I am here with John Cronley, who is leads a technology group in acquisitions and mergers. I think, John, you can tell us
Sure.
a little bit more about yourself personally and professionally.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tom, for including me in the podcast. As you said, I'm John Cronley. I lead up acquisition group for Excelitas Technologies. We're a technology company focused around precision instrumentation in lighting, optics, photonics, and sensing. 52-year-old male, married with 23 years, two daughters, one that's 17, going to be 18 here, senior in high school, and then a 20-year-old who's a junior in college.
So you have your hands
Born,
full. Hands
yeah,
full. Where are you from? You
yeah,
from?
originally from a rural part of Southwest Michigan. Born in a small town, Battle Creek, Michigan, raised in another small town, Sturgis, one of seven children, so somewhere lost in the middle. I have four sisters and two brothers. Um, yeah, born and raised Catholic. Been practicing, I would say, reasonably faithfully for all of my life.
Okay. So from the category of useless knowledge, Battle Creek, Michigan, isn't that where like Kellogg's and the cereals
Yeah,
are?
yeah, that's right. And I did participate in the longest cereal table in the world, and that was the big event in the late '70s, early '80s when I lived in Battle Creek. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. All right, well, tell us a little bit about your where did your faith start to play a
Sure.
role in your life? Did something trigger it, or where did it really take off there eventually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was born and raised Catholic, so kind of what do you call it? Cradle Catholic, something like that. I'd
Right.
characterize, my faith journey as, kind of overnight success that's taken place over a 50-year period. Really, I think, and maybe others can relate, my faith journey is really based upon lifelong set of trials, tribulations, challenges, and in some cases crises, where in life you learn as you go. You learn from your struggles. Ultimately, you come to a successful outcome. I look back early on in my life. We had a big family, as I mentioned, Tom. We struggled financially. My dad's businesses, he was in the car business, had a couple of dealerships at the time in the 1970s and 80s, weren't successful. We had this big family. So we pulled together, as a family. I didn't know any different at the time, but we're struggling, financially. But you're learning. We always stayed together, as a family. From that perspective, I think in life, like anyone, you have disagreements. So you're overcoming disagreements, whether they're with your brothers or sisters, or with family, or with friends, or with others. Certainly, relationships outside of family, whether they're professional relationships or relationships, romantic relationships, relationships with your spouse. I think throughout my career, certainly challenges there. I look back on, part of my faith formation and my faith journey, was built upon learning how to live through struggles, learning how to live through trials, learning how to live through challenges, um, is really, what has kind of been my faith journey. My dad died early in my life, so he had a health problem, and we struggle financially. My dad died pretty early. Learning how to overcome that, I think was a challenge. Um,
So talk a little bit about that if you can specifically. Obviously, a lot of these things influenced you at a young age, but
yeah.
what was it, to be able to adapt, you can go one way or the other with that.
Yeah.
What was it in the faith aspect of it that helped you overcome that?
Yeah, I think I look back and the times where I learned the most about my faith was at the deepest level of crises. So like when my dad passed away, he was my, he was my mentor. He was my friend. He was my, um, he was my dad. He was, it was, I had a, strong relationship. He's there and one day and then, gone the next. And so I'd characterize, my faith, we really learn about your faith when you're on your knees and you're looking to God and because you don't really have anything, there's nothing, you don't know what else to do. And so I think, I look at that. I had, one of my daughters had a health scare when she was, I guess it was 9 years old, and I had a seizure disorder that kind of came upon us, and I was there, when it was happening, and I look back on it, and I literally thought, while it was going on, while she was going to die, it happened, bam, 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 and I didn't know. I thought at the time she was choking, and you look, and you're literally on your knees, begging for mercy, asking for wisdom, asking, and so I think at those times. I think were kind of the foundation of my faith journey. I look at faith, as pretty simple. For me, it's about learning truly who we are as God being and God within. And I think that for me, each step along the way has been, a learning. And I've learned from the challenges, I've learned from my mistakes, and ultimately coming to a realization of of success. But it's overcoming these challenges, overcoming these crises, overcoming these trials that you have in life, and building that learning that you have God within. You are God being. You're made up of your mind. You're made up of your body. You are made up of a heart. You have a spirit. You have a soul, and that's what you are, and it can't really be compartmentalized. And it's all one. And for me, that my faith is learning that along the way. And believe me, it's not always been up and to the right. There's times where it's gone flatline. There's times where it's gone down. It's a learning event. But I also think in life, and you hear this a lot, that you learn from your failures far more than you learn from your success. And I do think that's your faith. And so when you're in the trials, when you're in the challenges, that's when you're learning about God. That's when you're learning about your faith. That's when you're learning about who you are. And like I said, for me, faith is simply learning, who you truly are, as a God being.
Yeah. And if I can drill down on that a little with you, is that kind of you understanding that you can only control so much, and that really ultimately God is in control of everything, and surrendering a little more?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that's a good question. I do think that as men, that is, Tom, I think that's probably the big, if I were to say, for me, that's probably the biggest obstacle for me as a man. And I think it's probably the same for many men. I think learning to surrender, having grown up in a large family, having grown up in a situation, that we had a lot of struggles, you learn to be very independent. And I think in our society and as Americans, and being in a capitalistic society, we are trained to be independent and rewarded to be independent, and it's good. It's not a bad characteristic. But I also think that ultimately learning to surrender is how you're really going to be closer to God, and how you're going to build your faith. And I do think that when I stopped, or starting to stop trying to do everything myself and starting to rely on others, and more importantly, turning my challenges, turning my problems, turning my my crises and my needs over to God, about surrendering. And that's it's hard, and I still have to work at it. And I think I go back and I'm like, I wasn't the smartest in my family. I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the most talented. But I even you can ask my brothers and sister. I certainly was the most independent. I graduated from high school. I left home and never looked back. And it wasn't like I had a bad relationship, with my family. I still, very close with them, but kind of left home at 17 and just been independent, and been married, but I do think that that's ultimately a big challenge, and maybe the biggest challenge for men in our society. I think it's a lot of it's fear-based. I think it's scary. I think you feel like you're losing independence. I mean, I'm sharing what my characteristics are. I feel like
No, I
it's
think
not
you're
manly.
100% like a lot of other men.
Yeah, I feel like, it's not macho, it's a sign of weakness, and actually it's a sign of strength, but it's packaged as a sign of weakness. And, I've also learned, the times when I've been successful, when I actually surrender and I turn over my challenges, I'm able to do far more than I ever thought I was capable of doing. My limits are really, the challenges I have between my two ears and in my mind. And when you realize, that, your mind is strong, your body is strong, but your spirit is the strongest. And when you can learn how to rely on your spirit within and surrender, over to God within, I mean, you're capable of things that are unimaginable.
That's a great line. That's a great line, the spirit. So talk a little bit. I'm sure maybe your dad comes up in this category, but either personally or professionally,
Yeah.
who influenced you from a primarily from a faith perspective, but what was it specifically that caught your attention and influenced you?
Yeah. As I think about that, the most influential is, I think it has to be at different times in my life, because growing up, my dad was a big part of my life, right? He was my rock, my friend, I shared a lot of interests with him, whether it was sports or whether it was, he was in the car business. I love cars. He was my mentor, all these things. And then, he's gone one day. So, I would say that the early years, so up until maybe I was 20, that was, he's probably the strongest in terms of the most influential. Different times in life, they get out of balance, and so we focus a lot on that. And so I think he's somebody that's faith based. He isn't Catholic, but he's certainly Christian, and he knows how important that is to me. I think later in life, I have two brothers, one 4 years younger and one that's a year older. And I look at them as also being, super important to me. They're good examples. We have a lot in common, but I also rely heavily on them. In terms of they live on different parts of the country than I do, but we still keep in touch, and they're an important point.
What do you think are the biggest obstacles preventing men, young, old? We many of us struggle from the same issues. What do you
Yeah,
think the biggest obstacles are for them to kind of live the faith or try to practice it?
sure. Yeah, I think that we talked a little bit about learning to surrender, and that's something that I know I have a challenge, and I still have to work at it, right? And so, I mean, it's one thing. I mean, I guess I've taken the first step of problem solving, identifying the problem. I know who the problem is, and that problem is me, and but when I'm working on it. So certainly around surrendering, I think there's an expectation, Tom. I am very much somebody who spends a lot of time in meditation, a lot of time, in silence, and a lot of time in prayer. And I think that there's an expectation from a lot of people in our society. Oftentimes, where you talk to somebody, whether it's a male or female, it doesn't really matter, where they say, I can't meditate, I can't slow my mind down, and it's like, well, that's the exact, what the reason why you need to do it. I can't slow down to meditate. And it's like, okay, start out at 10 seconds, then go to 20 seconds, then go to 1 minute, then go, that's the first step. I also often hear, a lot of, mostly guys, they talk to about prayer, and they say, well, I pray, but I get nothing from it.
Mm.
And I pray and nothing happens. And and I think that there's an expectation or not, we're not really an understanding of what prayer is. And for me, I can share with what it means to me. Prayer is, certainly about the meditation. It's about silence. It's about listening, but it's also, I think there's, like anything, we want outcomes. And I think there's a level of understanding what are realistic outcomes from prayer. And I think for me, it's, I'm pretty simple in that way. And this isn't anything that I've generated. It's something I've, read and learned and over time. Prayers are either, number one, they're either answered, All right. So you get what you want, what you pray for, and that's pretty simple. And, that's what we always want. We want it, exactly what we want when we want it. But that's not always going to happen. The second, outcome I think that you see from prayer is, you oftentimes get something that you didn't want, but it's a lot better than what you thought it was going to be, right? And I think that's certainly, very, very much important. But when I talk to, people, the third part of prayer, I think that is super important is that, which is the most, most often the outcome, is that you learn, the grace, the strength, the courage to accept and live with the outcome that you don't want. And, for me, that's what prayer, learning how to accept, I think is, if I'd say, as I've gotten older and, I don't know if I've gotten any wiser, but maybe a little bit smarter, surrender, number one, willing to accept, number two, is probably, an outcome that you may not want, learning to live with that, learning to accept it, learning, having the grace to embrace it, an outcome that, I didn't want this person to die. I didn't want, to lose the job. I didn't want. And ultimately you have to learn, how to accept. And I think that's probably, that acceptance is something that, I think is a challenge, for men.
So,
But one other point, I do want to make, Tom, I do think it's really important here, is that you hear a lot of folks and a lot of guys, talk about compartmentalizing, their life. Hey, I separate my family from my work, from my friends, and I actually, I guess you can do it. I guess some people are successful. I can't do it. I can't for me, it's all woven together. Now, I don't necessarily include all my, my work or my family with my personal life or with my professional life. But what I do know is that, your mind, your body, your heart, your spirit, your soul is all one. And you can't separate, that. We are human beings, and that's what differentiates us from any other being on earth, whether you're an animal or you're, something else other than human. And that's really what really defines, a human being is our spirit and our soul within.
and, any other myths or tips or, that you would say to wrap us up?
Yeah, I don't have anything other than I do think you know the key to anything is starting. So if you don't know where to start, that's exactly where you are, and Jesus is willing to accept you exactly where you are. And the hardest part is the first step. Whether you're trying to learn, get an education, whether you're trying to build a relationship with our Lord, whether you're trying to do anything in life, the first step is always the hardest. And no matter where you are in your life, I believe Jesus is willing to meet you there. And I think that's if I were to kind of wrap things up, I certainly see that in myself, because there are different times where I'm doing things very, very well. There's other times where I ain't doing so well, and you still have to pick yourself back up and dust yourself off, and after you got your butt kicked in this battle, and move on to the next one. So I think that's maybe how I would wrap things up.
Awesome. I appreciate you taking the time to share your journey and your wisdom with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.